The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, letting in the faint echo of footsteps and the weight of expectation. People shuffled in quietly, filling the benches one by one, their whispers barely audible under the watchful eyes of uniformed bailiffs. The air inside was thick with the sterile smell of polished oak, and the high ceiling carried an intimidating silence that pressed down on everyone seated. At the center of this stage, elevated above the rest, sat Judge Harold Whitmore, a man known across the state for his stern demeanor and reputation for upholding the law with an iron fist. He tapped his gavel once, the sharp crack bouncing off the marble walls. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice booming, controlled, and without warmth. All eyes shifted toward the defendant's table, where a tall black man in a perfectly pressed navy blue suit rose to his feet. His presence was striking, not just because of his commanding stature, but because of the calmness etched into his expression, the kind that spoke of years of self-discipline. His name was Marcus Bell. To the unknowing eye, he appeared like any other defendant forced to stand trial in this intimidating room. But there was something different about him, something that few in the room understood just yet. The clerk began to read the charges, her voice flat but the words heavy. "Marcus Bell, you stand accused of obstruction of justice and professional misconduct during the course of a federal trial." Gasps rippled through a few of the benches. Whispers filled the air, quickly silenced by the glare of a bailiff. To most, Marcus Bell looked like a man about to be crushed under the weight of the system, another black man standing accused, another life about to be reduced to a sentence handed down by a judge who had no understanding of his struggle. But Marcus didn't waver. He kept his eyes steady, his hands folded neatly in front of him, as though he had already lived through storms greater than this moment. Judge Whitmore peered down over his glasses, his expression unreadable but tinged with something cold. "Mr. Bell, these are serious accusations. Your actions have allegedly undermined the integrity of this court. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the courtroom door swung shut with a heavy thud, and a journalist stumbled in, fumbling with her notepad and pen. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the media presence was palpable. They had been waiting for this trial for weeks, branding it as a high-profile case of a black professional accused of overstepping the law. Marcus finally spoke, his voice deep, measured, and deliberate. "Your Honor, I respect this court, but I also respect the truth. And the truth will always stand, no matter what sentence you pass." The judge's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to defendants speaking with such calm authority. It rattled him, though he didn't show it. Instead, he leaned back and began to lecture, his words laced with superiority. "Truth, Mr. Bell, is a matter of law, not of opinion, and the law is what I uphold in this courtroom." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement, others shook their heads. The racial undertone of the exchange was impossible to ignore. The sight of a black man being lectured about truth and law by a white judge was a familiar script to many in the room. But Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, fixed not on the judge's robes or his gavel, but on the weight of his words. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution presented evidence that painted Marcus as reckless, unethical, and unfit for his profession. Witnesses were called, each one carefully chosen to cast shadows on his reputation. They spoke of alleged missteps, twisted details, and half-truths. To the jury, it was a flood of information designed to overwhelm, to push them toward a predetermined conclusion. But Marcus listened silently, jotting down notes with precise strokes of his pen. At times, he leaned forward, his jaw tightening, but he never interrupted. He knew better than most how a courtroom functioned. When the prosecution finally rested, Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and looked down at Marcus. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, Mr. Bell. It appears you've forgotten your place within the system." That last phrase, "forgotten your place," hung in the air like a venomous dart. Marcus's lips tightened, and murmurs spread across the gallery. Forgotten his place? The words echoed generations of injustice, of black men and women told to know their limits, to accept their position in a system not designed for them. Marcus rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, with respect, I haven't forgotten my place. I know exactly who I am and where I stand." His eyes scanned the room before returning to the judge. "And no sentence can change that." Judge Whitmore smirked faintly, almost dismissively. "We shall see." And with that, he struck his gavel once more. This court will recess before sentencing. The room erupted in whispers again, people leaning toward one another, questioning what they had just witnessed. Some saw a man already condemned. Others saw a man standing taller than the system meant to break him. As Marcus sat back down, his hands folded again, a quiet confidence radiated from him. There was something in his composure that unsettled the judge and confused the jury. He wasn't just another defendant. He wasn't broken. He wasn't pleading. He was waiting, because Marcus Bell knew something no one else in the room fully realized yet. And when that truth came to light, the entire courtroom, including Judge Whitmore, would fall silent. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people spilt into the hallways during recess. Some gathered in hushed groups, trading theories about what they had just witnessed. Others spoke with conviction, certain Marcus Bell was guilty before the verdict had even been read. A few, however, could not shake the image of a man standing tall, his dignity intact, refusing to bow before the weight of authority. Inside the judge's chambers, Harold Whitmore removed his robe and loosened his tie. His reflection stared back at him from a polished mirror above a mahogany cabinet, an aging man with lines of authority carved into his face. Yet beneath his stern expression was something else, unease. For reasons he could not fully explain, the defendant's calm words replayed in his mind. "I know exactly who I am and where I stand." They echoed louder than the gavel's strike. He shook it off. In his career, he had presided over countless cases, many involving young black men accused of crimes big and small. His sentences were always harsh, and his reputation for being tough on crime had earned him applause from certain circles. To him, justice was black and white, order and disorder. But Marcus Bell was different. He didn't fit the pattern. He wasn't broken, frightened, or begging. He was composed, almost as if he belonged on the other side of the bench. When the court reconvened, the crowd settled quickly, sensing that the most crucial moment was near. Judge Whitmore entered again, his robe flowing behind him as he ascended to his seat. "Bring the court to order," he commanded. The bailiff tapped his baton, and silence fell. Marcus rose as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling. His lawyer, a young woman named Danielle Price, placed a hand on his arm, whispering, "No matter what he says, keep calm. We'll fight this." Marcus gave her a small nod, though deep down, he already knew what was coming. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice carrying the cold authority that had marked his decades on the bench. "Marcus Bell, the evidence presented before this court leaves little room for doubt. Your actions have brought dishonor to your profession, disrupted the administration of justice, and betrayed the trust placed in you." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like an executioner's blade. "Therefore, this court sentences you to 5 years in state prison." A stunned silence gripped the room. Gasps rose from the gallery, followed by sharp whispers. Marcus's supporters buried their faces in their hands. Danielle shot up from her chair. "Your Honor, this is excessive. My client deserves a right to." The judge slammed his gavel down. "Order in the court." His voice thundered, drowning out any objection. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He simply stood there, his expression calm, his eyes locked on the judge's. And it was in that silence, calm, piercing, unwavering, that the balance of power subtly shifted. The judge, for all his authority, suddenly felt like the one being examined. Then came a voice from the back of the courtroom. "This doesn't make sense. Do you even know who he is?" The crowd turned, eyes darting toward the speaker, an older black man with graying hair and a sharp suit. He had been sitting quietly through the proceedings, his presence barely noticed. But now, as he rose and took a step forward, the tension in the room thickened. Judge Whitmore scowled. "Bailiff, remove him." But before the bailiff could act, the man raised his hand. "Wait! The people deserve to know the truth before you pass judgment any further." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. He had known this moment was coming. He had hoped it would arrive naturally, but perhaps it was better this way, sudden, undeniable. The man's voice grew louder, firm with conviction. "The man you just sentenced isn't just a defendant. He isn't some name pulled from a file or a headline twisted by the media. He is Marcus Bell, chief prosecutor of this very district. The man who has put away more criminals in 5 years than your entire bench has seen in a decade. The words crashed into the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps turned into outright cries of disbelief. Journalists scrambled for their pens, hands flying across notepads. Danielle's lips curved into a thin, defiant smile. Judge Whitmore froze. His gavel hung uselessly in his hand, his mouth open but without sound. He blinked once, then again, as though trying to process what he had just heard. The older man continued. Marcus Bell is not here as a defendant. He's here because he dared to challenge corruption that runs deep in this system. And now you've handed down the harshest sentence you could muster, without realizing you just condemned the very man who upholds the law more faithfully than anyone else in this city. All eyes turned back to Marcus. He remained standing, his calmness now carrying an entirely different weight. He wasn't just a black man in a suit. He wasn't a defendant fighting to clear his name. He was a lead prosecutor, an officer of justice who had built his career on truth, integrity, and service. Judge Whitmore's face paled. His authority cracked, his confidence unraveling before the public eye. He shifted in his chair, tugging at his collar. Is this true? His voice was low, almost hesitant. Marcus finally spoke. Yes, Your Honor. I am the lead prosecutor of this district, and I've dedicated my life to ensuring justice, not for some, but for all. Today, I stand accused not because I failed the law, but because I refuse to let the law be used as a weapon against the innocent. The room erupted. Supporters cheered. Some even stood to clap, while others shouted in outrage of the system's betrayal. The bailiff scrambled to maintain order, but the momentum had shifted entirely. Judge Whitmore pounded his gavel, but the sound was hollow now. His booming voice carried no weight. He was no longer the unquestioned authority. He was a man who had just humiliated himself by condemning the very prosecutor sworn to uphold the law. For the first time in his career, Judge Harold Whitmore fell silent. The silence stretched on, heavy, unyielding. He tried to gather words, to piece together authority, but his tongue failed him. The gavel sat in his trembling hand, powerless. And in that silence, Marcus Bell stood taller than ever, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a man whose truth had shattered the very walls built to contain him. The trial wasn't over, but the war for dignity had already been won. The courtroom had erupted into chaos. Reporters were scribbling notes so fast their pens nearly tore through paper. Supporters clapped and shouted, while a handful of skeptics demanded proof. The bailiffs yelled for silence, but their voices were swallowed in the wave of noise. Through it all, Judge Whitmore sat frozen, his gavel resting limp against the bench. His reputation as the unshakable enforcer of the law was crumbling before hundreds of eyes. Marcus Bell remained composed. He didn't raise his hands to silence the room, nor did he gloat. Instead, he stood in dignified silence, allowing the weight of revelation to settle. He understood that sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and in that moment, his silence declared everything. I am not who you thought I was. Finally, Danielle Price, Marcus's defense attorney, stepped forward. Her young face carried both fire and conviction. She addressed the judge directly, her voice carrying over the din, Your Honor, you have just sentenced a man who has spent his career defending this very system. A man who has sacrificed his nights, his family, and his peace to uphold the law. And you did so without recognizing him, without even allowing the truth of his position to be acknowledged in this courtroom. What does that say about the way justice is delivered here? The crowd quietened, leaning in to hear every word. Danielle pressed on, her tone sharper now. How many other men and women, black men and women, have stood in this courtroom, reduced to defendants, dismissed without dignity, condemned without care, because you never took the time to see them for who they truly are? How many have been judged not by the facts, but by the color of their skin? Her words hung heavy in the air. Even those who had doubted Marcus now looked inward, unease etching itself into their expressions. Marcus finally raised his head, breaking his silence. His deep voice carried across the room, calm yet thunderous in its impact. I've spent years standing on the other side of this courtroom, Your Honor. I've argued cases with precision, fought for justice with every ounce of strength I had, and I've looked into the eyes of men and women who came through these doors afraid of losing everything. I knew their fear because I carry it too. Being black in this country means you never walk into a room as just yourself. You carry the weight of history, the suspicion of strangers, and the unspoken question, do you belong here? He paused, scanning the crowd. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others nodded in agreement. Marcus's voice deepened. I prosecuted criminals because justice demands it. But I never forgot that behind every file was a human being. And now, when I stand here accused, I see the very system I defended turn its back on me. Not because the evidence is overwhelming, not because I am guilty, but because I dared to challenge corruption, and because I wear the skin I was born with. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the scratch of a reporter's pen stopped. Judge Whitmore's face flushed crimson. He slammed his gavel down, desperate to reclaim authority. This court will have order, he barked, his voice breaking slightly. But the command lacked its usual force. The people no longer feared him. They were watching a man unravel before their eyes. From the gallery, a young black woman stood up. Her voice trembled, but it carried conviction. His right. My brother was sentenced in this courtroom last year. He never got a chance to explain himself. He was just another number to you, Judge. You never saw him as a man. Another voice joined in, an older gentleman near the back. And my nephew, he got 10 years for a mistake that should have been probation. You don't see us. You never see us. The room swelled with voices, one after another, stories spilling out like long-buried secrets finally clawing their way to light. Names, sentences, injustices, all tied together by a single thread, the weight of bias, the sting of being unseen. Whitmore pounded his gavel again and again, but the voices rose louder, refusing to be silenced. His robe no longer carried authority. It was fabric draped over a man exposed. Marcus raised a hand gently, and the crowd began to quiet. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. His calm presence alone commanded respect. I didn't ask for this, Marcus said softly, yet his words carried. But perhaps it was always meant to happen. Not for me, but for every voice that has been silenced, every life diminished by the shadow of injustice. Today, this courtroom isn't just about Marcus Bell. It's about all of us, about dignity that cannot be stripped by a gavel, about truth that cannot be buried by lies, and about justice that belongs to the people, not the powerful. Tears welled in Danielle's eyes as she looked at him. The gallery sat spellbound. Reporters scribbled frantically, aware they were witnessing history. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his once steady hands trembling. His career had been built on fear, on rulings that crushed the spirit of those who stood before him. But now, fear had turned its back on him. He was the one exposed, stripped of control by the sheer presence of truth. He tried to speak, his voice faltering. This is highly irregular. The defendant's identity should have been disclosed. Marcus cut him off, his tone steady but firm. The defendant's identity was irrelevant until you made it clear you didn't care who I was. You saw a black man standing trial, and that was all you needed to decide my fate. My title doesn't protect me. My position doesn't shield me. My skin made me guilty before I even opened my mouth. The words struck like a hammer. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes burning into the judge. Whitmore's shoulders slumped. For the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of accountability pressed down on him. The gavel that once made him untouchable now felt like a useless relic. He realized, perhaps too late, that this trial would define not Marcus Bell, but himself. And in that moment, the roles had shifted entirely. The judge was the one on trial. The people were the jury. And Marcus Bell, black man, prosecutor, and voice of dignity, was their witness. The room had shifted. What began as a trial against Marcus Bell had become something else entirely, a trial of the very system itself. Every breath, every whisper, every stare now pressed down on Judge Harold Whitmore, the man who had once commanded absolute authority in this chamber. His gavel sat idle, his voice lost, his master's superiority slipping with each passing second. Marcus stood tall in the center of it all, no longer a defendant but a symbol. His calm composure radiated strength. He didn't need to raise his voice. His very presence had turned the courtroom into a mirror, reflecting back the truth so many had endured but never spoken aloud. Danielle Price, his attorney, broke the silence. Your Honor, this sentence cannot stand. Not only is it unjust, It is a stain on this courtroom's credibility. You cannot sentence a man whose very career has been built on protecting the law. You cannot silence him for defending integrity. And you certainly cannot do so when the world now knows who he truly is. Her words rang with conviction. Even the journalists, usually detached observers, nodded slightly as they scribbled their reports. Marcus turned to face the gallery. His deep voice carried steady, like a sermon. Every day, I walked into this building believing in justice, believing that if we worked hard enough, argued fiercely enough, and held on to truth tightly enough, the law would prevail. But today I stand here as proof that the law, in the wrong hands, can be twisted into something unrecognizable. And still, he paused, letting the silence deepen. Still I will not let bitterness win. Because dignity is not something a judge can give or take away. Dignity is something we hold inside, no matter what the world tries to strip from us. Tears shone in the eyes of several people in the gallery. Some bowed their heads. Others clasped their hands together in solidarity. Marcus looked back at Whitmore, his gaze piercing. You thought you were sentencing me, but what you really did was reveal yourself. You showed this courtroom, this city, and this country the truth about how justice can be tainted by prejudice. And for that, I don't need to say another word. Your silence says enough. The judge's lips parted, but no sound came. He adjusted his glasses, wiped sweat from his brow, and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The gavel felt heavy in his hand, its power meaningless. For the first time in decades, he could not find words to defend himself. The crowd was still, waiting, watching. The power dynamic had fully reversed. Whitmore was no longer the arbiter of justice. He was a man stripped bare, forced to confront the consequences of his own bias. The older black man who had spoken earlier stepped forward once more. His voice was calm but resolute. Judge Whitmore, history will remember this day, not because Marcus Bell was accused, but because you condemned him without seeing him, and because when the truth stood before you, you could not even speak. The judge lowered his head. For a long, unbearable moment, silence filled the courtroom. It was not the silence of authority nor of fear. It was the silence of a man realizing the weight of his own failure. Marcus nodded slowly, then turned to Danielle. We're done here. But before he could leave the table, a juror stood. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, but her voice carried clarity. I will not endorse this verdict. If this trial is to mean anything, it must end with truth. And the truth is, this man is not guilty. Another juror stood, then another. One by one, they rose, declaring their refusal to uphold the sentence. It was unprecedented, spontaneous, but unstoppable. The people had seen too much and felt too deeply. The tide had turned. Whitmore's gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered uselessly onto the bench. He didn't even try to retrieve it. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, barely audible. This court is adjourned. The words, usually final, carried no authority this time. They were a surrender, an admission of defeat. Marcus turned, walking past the gallery. As he moved, people stood in respect, forming a silent corridor for him. Some reached out, touching his arm gently as he passed. Others whispered thank you, their voices breaking. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, drawn by whispers of what was happening inside. When Marcus stepped through the doors, a roar erupted, cheers, chants, and cries of solidarity. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, but Marcus raised a hand gently, silencing them with the same quiet authority he carried inside. He spoke only a few words, but they would echo far beyond that day. Justice is not a gift from the powerful. Justice is a right of the people. And dignity is ours, even when they try to take it. The crowd erupted again, their voices rising like a tide, not just in support of Marcus Bell, but in defiance of every injustice that had come before. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitmore sat alone. The benches were empty, the murmurs gone. The gavel lay on the bench, silent and abandoned. For the first time in his long career, he understood what silence truly meant. Not control, not authority, but defeat. And in that silence, the weight of history pressed down on him. He was no longer the man who had handed down sentences without care. He was a man who would forever be remembered as silent when justice demanded words. Marcus Bell walked forward, his head high, his dignity unbroken. The system had tried to crush him, but instead it had revealed its own cracks. And through those cracks, truth had poured in, unstoppable, undeniable, eternal. The story of that day would spread across headlines, across living rooms, and across communities that knew too well the sting of injustice. It would inspire conversations, movements, and change. And most importantly, it would remind the world that dignity cannot be silenced, not by prejudice, not by power, not by gavel. Because dignity, once revealed, becomes unstoppable.